Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
By an extraordinary convergence of political weakness and electoral mathematics, this country now stands on the brink of committing to war in Syria. Jeremy Corbyn had gone into the meeting of his shadow cabinet expecting to call on them to back his opposition to airstrikes. He emerged after pressure from his front bench, promising his MPs a free vote. What happens next comes down to a debate on Wednesday, which the Prime Minister has just tabled, and the vote that will then follow. But from all the signs tonight, it looks as if the government could now have enough support from the opposition benches to give the PM the mandate he needs. Tonight, we'll look at the timetable for any future strikes and whether the British public supports the action. We'll also ask how that relationship between the Labour leader, his cabinet and his supporters may have inadvertently brought us to where we are tonight. First up, here's Allegra Stratton.
Today's shadow cabinet meeting is perhaps the most important gathering held in the Palace of Westminster so far this Parliament. Shadow cabinet members told me that they were on the verge of resignation before it. The meeting would decide whether Britain strikes Syria, but also whether Syria breaks Labour.
In the hour before it, the Leader's Office put out the results of a poll they conducted over the weekend that they say shows 75% of Labour members that replied oppose the idea of strikes on Syria. Now, I imagine in this meeting, Shadow Cabinet members will resist this poll and its findings. They think it's their opinion that should matter.
Over the weekend, Jeremy Corbyn's team, heirs to Tony Benn, looked like they were digging in, that they would force people to vote against airstrikes and so force a mass walkout. Long negotiations with Deputy Leader Tom Watson attempted to bring the Labour leader back from this brink.
We've just bumped into one of Jeremy Corbyn's closest allies. This morning they thought that there probably would end up being a free vote, but they say they're not so sure, and there's three reasons. The first is that over the weekend they say many MPs have been shocked by the strength of feeling opposing striking Syria. The second is they say that many members have also been shocked by the behaviour or disloyalty of the Parliamentary Labour Party. They feel the Parliamentary Labour Party should be supporting the leader. And thirdly, Jeremy Corbyn has made a life's work out of opposing military action. There is a sense, they say, that if he can't oppose this, what's the point of him?
Moments later, a decision, a free vote after all. The leader's advisers stressed that Jeremy Corbyn offered a free vote of his own free will, but we know he did seriously consider whipping the whole party to oppose airstrikes. It was agreed the party would be double-headed, the leader saying one thing and his shadow foreign secretary another.
The truth is it will reflect where we are, and there are different views on this within the shadow cabinet. There's different views on this within the parliamentary party, and there's probably different views on this within the general public too. So of course I understand what you're saying, but it's a reflection of where we are with this debate.
Even for those opposed to strikes, there was unhappiness.
I've never seen or heard anything like this before. The rule book says that the decision on how to whip, whether to whip, is taken by the shadow cabinet, and that is final. And for me as an MP, what matters to me is the whip, whether we have one or not. I mean, it's fine if we have the views of 70,000 Labour Party members, but you can't make a policy like that on the hoof.
It is the end of a long and tiring day, and the Labour Party is right now meeting up that staircase and round the corner in their weekly parliamentary party meeting. The party is tonight battered. It's also bent in two. The Shadow Foreign Secretary will make one case from the dispatch box, the Labour leader another. But it isn't as bad as it might have been. The party could have been dealing with mass resignations.
Actually, what we had tonight was a really considered debate about Syria, which is what we should have been doing for the last 4 days. I feel like this could have been handled a hell of a lot better.
David Lammy, how was that meeting for you? Say what you really think.
I mean, it was a very heated meeting. I found it deeply unfortunate that we as a party spent the weekend terribly internal about ourselves and not directed at this very, very serious decision.
Stopping military action is an article of faith for Jeremy Corbyn. On this, he could have whipped Labour, but he chose party unity over political purity. The vote is due on Wednesday, and with possibly more than 50 Labour rebels, Jeremy Corbyn's Labour now looks unlikely to stop David Cameron.
That was Allegra Stratton, and joining us now, the Shadow Work and Pension Secretary Owen Smith, who was in that Shadow Cabinet meeting for how many hours this afternoon, Owen?
Best part of 2 hours.
Right, OK. And you will be voting against the airstrikes, is that right?
Yes, Emily, I thought very, very carefully about this, and I was somebody who might have been persuadable by the Prime Minister, and I didn't speak last week, and I chose to think and talk to people over the weekend, and as I have done over the recent months, and I've come to the conclusion that the Prime Minister has, for me, for this MP, not made the case compellingly enough, either that limited bombing action, which is what he's proposing, is going to assist in defeating ISIL, which I think we can all agree is what we ought to be aiming for, or achieve what beyond that we need, which is a lasting political resolution in Syria.
So you're on the same page as Jeremy Corbyn
on this issue? I am. I think
and you would have liked to see him
call
presumably whip that vote?
No, I think the right thing is to have done exactly what he has done, which is come to the Shadow Cabinet recognising the very real, sincerely held, profoundly thought through
but you know he didn't want to do that. He
well,
came to the Shadow Cabinet wanting to tell
Emily.
people.
I don't know that at all. You asserted that the programme asserted that in the introduction. All I know is Jeremy came to the Shadow Cabinet today and said very clearly, right at the outset, that he was proposing that we have a free vote on this issue. And I think that is the right thing to do, reflective of both the disagreement, sincerely held disagreement within the Labour Party, but actually reflective of the country, where the people I talk to are conflicted about this and don't know what is necessarily the right thing to do. And I think if they had a clear understanding, as we do, of how limited a proposal is coming from the Prime Minister. I mean, David Cameron is the person who should be questioned here tonight, but because it is he who has failed to make a substantive case. Well, he ought to come on and explain.
You know that we've been trying to work out the maths. From what you have registered now, and it's all rough at this stage before Wednesday, it sounds as if we will be committing to airstrikes, doesn't it, after that vote?
Well, the government has a majority of 12, and
but it's not just the government's majority, is it? It's the number of Labour MPs that we now know, somewhere, let's say, between 60 and 100, which is a big gap, but that would easily give him the mandate to do that. Yes,
and I'm sure that there are a number of my colleagues, I don't know how many, I've not asked them, not in sufficient numbers to be certain of what the absolute total is, but there will be a lot of them who've thought just as carefully as I have about this, as has Hilary Benn, as have others who are convinced.
Try and change their mind? I mean, what is the position now? Is it up to you and to Jeremy Corbyn and to others who don't agree with airstrikes to go to your fellow MPs and try and make the case for them not voting?
No, because I think we've decided as a party, and I'm a member of the Shadow Cabinet, and we as the Shadow Cabinet have agreed that there ought to be a free vote. So it is for members, based on their belief, on their conscience, to make a decision. So it's not like the noes are the party line at all, then? No, we don't have a party line on this. The point is we have decided that there is disagreement within the Labour Party as to whether we should be supporting this particular proposal. I think we need to differentiate between the notion of our getting involved militarily in Syria at all at some point and the proposal that is on the table from the Prime Minister, because it is a false dichotomy, I think,
if I was a Labour voter, if I was a voter in Oldham, let's say, this week, and I'm trying to work out what Labour's foreign policy is, are they a party that's anti-war, anti-intervention at this point, or are they not? What would you tell me is your policy?
That we are an extremely serious political party that has thought very seriously about the most important choice. The fact
you have to say seriously twice in the same sentence
choice that we can make. The most important choice we can make, Emily, which is whether we commit our troops, our country, to combat overseas with the inevitable loss of lives, military and civilian. And we've looked carefully, I've looked carefully at what David Cameron has proposed. He says his objective is to defeat ISIL. I agree that's what our objective should be.
But he says you can't tell resolution me, as a voter, where your foreign policy lies on intervention. You cannot do that because Jeremy Corbyn is going to say one thing and Hilary Benn, who should be the closest man to him on this issue, is going to say exactly the opposite.
Very straightforward. I think the most important thing is that we get the right decision for the country and we analyse what is placed before us by the Prime Minister on its merits, and we come to a conclusion as individual MPs. If we had been able to come to an agreement as a party, I think that would have been better. But we clearly weren't going to be able to do that, and that is reflective of the country.
To party members, supporters over the weekend, if he's right and he got 75% of the replies saying we don't want you to go into war in Syria, what was the point of that if he then allowed a free vote anyway?
Well, I think Jeremy was doing what he said he was always going to do, which is to reach out more to party members, to engage them in a more inclusive debate about policy. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, he could have come back with a result that wasn't in accordance with his views. That's perfectly foreseeable. I'm not sure what my CLP would think if all members' views were tested. What I am certain about is for this MP, when I've looked at the case that has been put by the Prime Minister, I am not convinced that we will make Britain a safer place.
Understood.
And I'm not convinced that we will hasten the resolution of the crisis.
So it's kind of laughing in the face of your supporters to an extent, because, you know, whether you like him or loathe him, you understand that Jeremy Corbyn is a man of principle, right? We all know he's stopped the war. We know he doesn't like intervention, and yet he hasn't showed leadership. He's bottled it.
Well, I think we're all men and women of principle. That's why I started by saying I and lots of my colleagues, all of my colleagues, have considered this.
On this issue, he has bottled it. He could have taken this decision and said, I believe in this very strongly. I lead the Labour Party. My supporters have told me that they back me. I'm taking that to Parliament. Why didn't he?
Because he is seriously reflecting on the fact that there is not an agreed position within the Labour Party, that there are different views held sincerely by different members across the party, and that is why the sensible thing for us to do was to have a free vote. But I come back to the substantive issue, because that is what we ought to be debating here tonight. It is not about the Labour Party, it is not about Jeremy Corbyn, it's certainly not about individual MPs. It is about whether the right thing to do is to engage in what will be relatively limited bombing, maybe 10 planes from the UK, adding to the already 2,500, 3,000 strikes that have been administered by the Americans and the French. Now, the question is that going to hasten the end of ISIL and a Syrian resolution? And I'm not convinced that that is the case, and I'm not convinced that we will make Britain a safer place if we engage in that. We need to think much more deeply about our long-term strategies as a Western power in the Middle East. That's what the Labour Party needs to do.
That's exactly where we are taking that debate, because earlier tonight David Cameron promised a very long, a very full debate and a vote in the Commons on Wednesday. He said it'd be the right thing to do and would be in the national interest to keep the country safe. Then he was asked about that figure of 70,000 moderate troops on the ground in Syria. Big uncertainty at this stage, that the PM implied were ready to support British airstrikes.
The 70,000 figure was provided to me by my experts, and that's why I made that point in the House of Commons. Obviously in Iraq we have ground troops there in terms of the Iraqi army and the Kurdish Peshmerga forces. As I said last week, the Syrian situation is more complicated, but there are some ground troops in terms of Free Syrian Army and other troops that are able to take action against ISIL.
David Cameron speaking earlier. Let's pick up with Mark Urban. What happens now for the government then?
Well, as you've been discussing, the debate and the vote on Wednesday, people are talking in government about anything, as you said. I'm hearing similar things, 60 to 100 Labour dissidents. That gives David Cameron what he wanted, for it not to be firstly a whip thing, a party political division over this issue, and secondly a substantial majority potentially for strikes. The RAF, I'm told, will pretty much immediately, probably that night, start flying reconnaissance over targets. It's possible what they call dynamic targeting. The JTAC, the air controller, may give them a target that night, and they may well start. Even if they don't, it's only likely to be a day or two before they do start hitting targets in Syria.
So they can be ready that quickly, can they?
Well, they're already flying against targets in Iraq, and they can do that. Now, the other question, it's interesting hearing your earlier discussion, this perception that the UK can't bring that many aircraft to the fight. They are determined to increase the number. There's pretty limited leeway in the RAF on that. And what I've been hearing is that the current 8 tornadoes in Akrotiri will be supplemented. So, of course, they can't just move those 8 planes around between now Iraq and Syria. People would say, well, you're just shifting around the same deck chairs, as it were, on the deck. They're going to send 2 more tornadoes, that's the plan, and 6 Typhoon aircraft. So they will have, they hope, relatively quickly in Akrotiri, up to 16 jets to carry out airstrikes against IS targets in those 2 countries. They are trying to increase the level of British military activity. I have to say, when you factor in as well defence of UK airspace, that's pretty much it. That's pretty much the whole Royal Air Force committed.
Mark Urban, thanks very much indeed. Well, joining us now, Tony Blair's former Chief of Staff, Jonathan Powell, who's written extensively on the question and timing of intervention. Indeed, his latest book is Talking to Terrorists. Very nice of you to come in. When you listen to Mark laying it out there in such stark terms, it feels like the country is being readied for war, and I guess you'll say this is just the other half of the equation that Iraq has already started.
Yes, I find it hard to see how there can be a logical position against bombing in Syria, but in favour of bombing in Iraq. You can be against bombing altogether, but what sense does it make to say we'll bomb ISIL one side of the border they don't recognise, but not bomb them on the other?
And yet politically for the UK, you recognise this is a big step. This needed to be a convincing argument for all the reasons we understand about it not being an invitation of a sovereign territory.
Well, no, actually, I don't. I don't think this is the start of a big war. I don't quite understand why it's seen as such a big step. It is actually just doing what ISIL do, which is not regarding the border. I mean, there are some much bigger questions that come later, because bombing is necessary but not sufficient. Bombing is necessary to help the Kurds, for example, to hang on to Kobani inside Syria, necessary to recapture Sinjar.
So do you think we shouldn't have, if you like, bothered with any of the parliamentary vote? Do you think David Cameron should have said, I'm pretty sure of this and we're doing it already, so let's get on doing it?
No, he had to win a vote. He should, in my view, have won it a year ago, but now it looks as if he will be able to win it now. But I think there's some very serious questions about what comes next, because I say bombing is not sufficient, it is necessary, but it won't solve the problem. If our aim is to degrade and destroy ISIL, we're going to have to do a lot more than just bomb them.
70,000, you've heard that figure. We're all now thinking of that as, if you like, the 45-minute figure.
Yeah.
Does it ring true from what you know, these troops?
I think there probably are 70,000 fighters inside Syria, but at the moment they're busy fighting Assad and they don't have any intention of going to fight Daesh or ISIL. We're going to have to find different fighters than that. The Kurdish fighters have fought to the edge of Kurdish territory very bravely. They're not going to go any further, nor should they be going into Sunni Arab areas. You can't leave it to the Shia militias from Baghdad. So who is actually going to do this fighting? I think that's the question that needs to be seriously answered.
And it's not going to make us safer, this, is it? You can't realistically say that Britain at home becomes a safer country.
Well, it does if we deal with ISIL. I mean, if we just leave ISIL there, we will be attacked, just as they were in Paris. I mean, we can't just ignore it. We know that 9/11 came out of Afghanistan. You've got to deal with these issues if you want to prevent these sort of attacks. You can't deal with them here. You're going to have to deal with them at the root.
It seems a very simple equation, this, a very simple question to you. It clearly isn't one for the Labour Party at the moment. Do you think that part of this self-flagellation, or a large part of this self-flagellation that Labour's going through now, is precisely because of the Iraq war?
Well, obviously there's a hangover from the Iraq war, just as there was before from previous wars. Black Hawk Down in Somalia, stop people intervening in Kosovo. You have to get over those things and make a rational decision in each case you approach in the future.
But when you say rational, I mean, people will look back and say, actually, in foreign policy terms, that was the worst decision that any leader has made since Suez.
Well, you can say that if you want, but it doesn't mean you don't make the right decision this time. You don't want to be hung over by the last decision. You need to make a rational decision now. You don't want to lash out in the heat of emotion. You want to make a cool, rational decision. And if your aim is to...
So I guess what I'm asking then, is it right that we have questioning leaders now? Do you admire Mr Corbyn for saying, hang on everyone, let's make sure that we know what we're going into? Or do you see a Labour Party that
No, I think it's absolutely right that everyone should ask questions. We need a serious strategy, we need a serious military strategy and a serious political strategy. As I say, bombing makes sense, but you need to have ground forces if you're going to take territory. We need to know
ground forces?
There need to be ground forces. At the moment, I don't know whose ground forces those are going to be, because no one yet has said who they're going to be, and you can't do it without ground forces. And you need a political strategy that involves dealing with the grievances of the Sunnis who have been disenfranchised in both Iraq and in Syria, and in the end, in my view, talking to them, just as we talked to the IRA, the PLO and other groups in the past.
But you're raising the question of ground forces. Where do you think those need to come from? You cannot see a UK Prime Minister now putting in British ground troops, can you, or can you?
That's what people are going to have to think about. This is a coalition, it's not
you would
just
say
Britain.
Yes.
I would say that if there are no other forces, we're going to have to put Western forces in. Not necessarily British forces, but they're going to have to be Western forces. But it's a coalition, not something that Britain can decide by itself.
And you believe you've written extensively about the need to communicate with terrorists and get that dialogue going. Is ISIS on the cards for that?
I would have thought so. If we look back at our history, every time we meet a new terrorist group, we say we'll never talk to them, we say we'll defeat them, yet we always end up talking to them.
Even apocalyptic death cult?
Well, if we just dismiss this as a mad death cult, we're making a big mistake. Unfortunately, they're perfectly rational. They know they can get our attention by killing people in horrific ways. If they were just a mad death cult, they'd be easy to deal with. They're not.
Thank you very much. I know you're going to stay with us. What has led up to what's increasingly looking like a move to military action? It's been overshadowed by those party political splits, and tonight Jeremy Corbyn claimed the debate was running away from David Cameron and that his case was falling apart. Well, Rachel Sylvester of The Times and Clive Lewis, who's an MP and director of Momentum, that campaign group that supports Jeremy Corbyn, here with us. He's correcting me right now. Jonathan Powell. Tell us, Clive, your position then.
Just for the record, I mean, I advise some of the people who work for Momentum, and obviously it's got a rep, but actually I'm
director is too
I'm
posh
not a director,
title.
I'm not a chair, so I mean, yeah, that's for the record, to keep it straight.
Rachel, if you can talk us through what Downing Street will be feeling tonight, what is your sense now of, has the battle run away with David Cameron, or is he in control?
No, I think they'll be feeling very relieved. They said that they wouldn't hold a vote unless they were pretty sure of winning it, and the vote's going ahead, and the fact that Jeremy Corbyn's had to concede a free vote has definitely shifted the balance of power back to David Cameron, and it makes it much more likely that the airstrikes will go ahead. This was one issue on which the Labour opposition, which has been pretty powerless since the election, actually had some power because they had the ability to determine the result in Parliament. And so what's happened today is really significant.
But they've given that power away. Isn't that very frustrating for the grassroots?
I think it's a matter of conscience, and I think when you listen to the so-called grassroots, they would have seen that many MPs have agonised over this, have thought over it. And I look back to, I wasn't there obviously, but I look back to the Iraq War, where we were whipped. I look back to Libya, where we were whipped. They didn't end too well. And I actually think the way that we are approaching this, in terms of giving MPs the chance to analyse, to assess and come to an assessment and a conclusion of how they're going to vote. I actually think, I know we laugh at the term new politics, but I actually think this is a good thing. I think we're approaching it in a far more mature way, and I think many people out there in the world would like, in the country, would like to see us.
Do you recognise that? Is that something that you would say? We don't need leadership per se. We like new politics, and we like something that's not whipped like Iraq.
Well, but there are a bunch of people in the country who will be disenfranchised unless you have a voice of opposition, unless they are represented by a coherent opposition. Who's speaking for them?
And the problem is, if Labour was in government, would they bomb or wouldn't they? If you've got the Shadow Foreign Secretary on one position, the leader in the other position, then how are the voters meant to know whether or not airstrikes would go ahead were Labour to be in power? So therefore they're not really behaving like a credible alternative government.
I think it's really interesting. I was looking at the newspapers as they came in. I was looking at how much space has been devoted to the Labour Party's internal machinations. I've been watching the news today. I've been on about 5 programmes where I've been asked to come on and talk about Syria. And yet each occasion I've been on, I've ended up talking about the Labour Party. Now, I understand it's a very interesting concept.
But it's also today, isn't it? Because on Wednesday, when we actually know what the vote is and we've counted the numbers, we will be in a position where we can talk directly about Syria as opposed to hypothesising.
And what I would like to see, and I think what the media should be doing, and it's not for me to tell them, but I think we should be doing, we should be questioning David Cameron. We're on the brink, potentially, of sending an extra 6 planes, 14 planes, into Syria to bomb. As we speak now, if that vote goes through, there will be women and children, potentially, who will be dying because of that decision. That is not something, as an MP, that I feel particularly happy being whipped on. So as a matter of conscience...
So for that reason, if that alone, wouldn't it have been better then to see a very strong message that went right through the party saying we are anti this and we're now going to be the party that holds David Cameron to account? You can't be that
party
anymore.
But I think most people know, we've all said that it's as a matter of conscience. Before, it was just mentioned about how we still have a so-called hang-up. The echoes of Iraq still echo through our party. I think many MPs, talking to them, listening to them, are affected by that. They listen to that, and I think it's right and proper.
Rachel, is this sustainable? Do you think, this is the new politics, this is how opposition's working now, this is a pretty important decision. Does that seem to you a a position that they can hold on to?
No, what I think isn't sustainable is the fact that you've got a huge chunk of the Parliamentary Labour Party absolutely at odds with their leader. And I think this isn't just to do with Syria, actually. It's to do with the fact that the MPs feel they have a mandate from their constituents, and the leader feels he has a mandate from his members. And there's a sort of total clash of not just ideologies, but sort of the principles of politics. So the MPs want to win the election, and they want to adopt policies which reach out to people beyond the Labour tribe. And what they feel is that the Corbynistas really just want to appeal within the tribe and sort of have a kind of reassuring, self-affirming...
Can I actually say, I actually think as an MP, yes, I want to win an election in 2020, but yes, I also want to make the right decision when it comes to taking one of the most serious decisions I'll have to make to potentially send our forces into warfare, potentially put themselves at risk and killing women and children. I think I'm entitled.
So what does Momentum do? Does it lobby the MPs? Does it take the views of supporters now to MPs and try and hold them to a no vote?
No, you see, I think if you look at what Momentum does, Momentum isn't one central organisation which comes out with a line. Momentum is a grassroots organisation made up of thousands of Labour Party members. Well, I think as an MP, I expect to be lobbied by constituents, by party members, by party members of Momentum, by people from Progress, from the Fabians. I'm an MP. That's what I expect. What I don't expect, I don't think what anyone condone, is abuse, and I think that's wrong. And I think what Jeremy Corbyn has said, he's given a free vote, respect that.
Is this a Labour Party that you recognise?
No, I think there's a problem in this country when we don't have a strong opposition. And as long as we're talking about ourselves as a party instead of talking about the issues, then the problem that Clive talks about is what we're going to have.
And whose fault is that then?
I think it's a problem of a clash between a leader and a party in the country and a party in Parliament. And it's not sustainable for a very long period of time. I don't see how you keep this together.
Well, it's a clash between the membership, who overwhelmingly voted for him, and MPs who have never accepted that. That's part of this story.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thanks for coming in.
I've been getting